And before we begin, just a little bit about our presenter today. Simon Schillebeeckx is a counter expert. He's assistant professor of strategic management at Singapore Management University. His research focuses on intersection of digitalization and sustainability. And Dr. Schillebeeckx is also co-founder of Global Mangrove Trust, a nonprofit that uses blockchain and remote sensing to support mangrove reforestation and Handprint, a fast-scaling venture whose mission is to integrate a positive impact on every business transaction. So I could go on, but I'll let him do the talking now. So welcome, Simon.
Thanks, Rich, for the kind introduction, and thanks everyone for joining. I know this is not a very conventional timing. I'm based in Singapore, so the time difference is between 13 and 15 hours, I think, with the US and Canada. So much appreciated that you're making time for attending this talk in the evening. Before I'll start getting into the talk, I'll just give you a little bit of background about myself so that you know where I come from, and then I'll go towards the topic of this talk. So by training, I'm an economist, and I got reformed into a management scholar and a strategy thinker during my PhD. Before that, I was a consultant focusing really on the intersection of sustainability and innovation. And in my research, this is the kind of work that I've been trying to do ever since. So I'll show you a couple of my academic publications, knowing that this probably doesn't mean much to most of you. But so I started working in the first couple of years of my PhD on business models for rural electrification. And I had a specific interest in how companies deal with scarcity of natural resources. And so a lot of my initial research focused on this question of how is it that companies manage natural resources like rare earths, but also oil, in terms of can they do so in a sustainable way? At the same time, I also had a very strong interest into what are the drivers of successful innovation. And so there's a variety of theories that are used in management, and I published a couple of papers in this field looking at like what makes teams and interorganizational collaborations good at coming up with new inventions, new ideas that have a high impact on the world. And so this was about my journey until 2018, after which I had the opportunity to start thinking about, is there a way of merging my interest in innovation and my interest in sustainability into a single field? And this single field now is become known as digital sustainability. And together with some of my co-authors, we've really written the most influential work on this in the past couple of years. It's a really young area of work, but it's very vibrant and there's a lot of stuff happening in this space. So one of the publications that really put us on the map was a publication we did for United Nations. There was commissioned work to investigate the interaction of digital finance and sustainability with a focus on Asia. And this was a report that was discussed in Davos in 2019 by a variety of business leaders. We then kind of topped it up with some academic research as well, and then started moving into, as long as this clicker still works, no. Okay, started moving into a variety of entrepreneurial ventures as well. So one of the publications, of course, that gave rise to this talk that I'm doing now is this article I had the chance to write for the Qatar Business Technology Journal. But on the side of that, as an academic, as many people will know, is that most of the things that academics do is sit in their ivory tower, look at the world, and then write about it. Typically articles that have very limited reach. Maybe, I mean, the Qatar Technology Business Journal is a bit different, but most of that thinking doesn't really reach the business world, unfortunately. And so I got frustrated with the lack of real world impact that I was hoping to have through academia, but realized that from the vantage point of academia alone, we couldn't do this. And so in 2017, as Rich already said, like I set up this nonprofit together with my, at the time, postdoctoral student that was working specifically on solving issues for poor, disadvantaged, poorly organized communities in Southeast Asia that had natural resources at their availability, specifically land to grow forests of mangroves, a very important tree in the fight against climate change, but didn't have any real way of accessing international climate funding. And we set up this NGO in order to help them achieve those goals. That NGO still exists, and we are working now with a variety of big players, including Marex, commodity broker, and Oxford University to develop a new way of certifying carbon credits using space-based verification. However, 2 years into the NGO journey, we also realized that if we really want to scale impact, the most efficient organizational forum for this is going to be a venture that can access risk financing, venture capital, and they can grow much faster because of that. And when we met an entrepreneur here in Singapore, who was also a friend of mine, we decided to set up Handprint. And these three things, so my academic career and then my two organizations really gave rise to this thinking that I will share with you today. So I'm really excited to talk to you about this, and let's get started. So ever since maybe about 10 years, but especially more recently with COP26 in Glasgow, the number 1.5 has been in the news a lot, right? This is the maximum amount of planetary heating in degrees centigrade that we can allow in order to avoid the worst of climate change. However, the 30 by 30, those two numbers are potentially equally important, but have received significantly less attention in the press. And that is the 30 by 30 initiative is an initiative by various countries and some companies to commit to the idea that we need to protect 30% of the land and the ocean's natural resources and turn them into national reserves in order to protect biodiversity and to prevent or at least reduce the risk of bio collapse, which is pretty much ongoing, right? If you look at the science of biodiversity, we are right now in a moment of what is known as the sixth extinction, where the speed at which we lose animal and plant species is about 1,000 times higher than at any time in the last 100,000 years. So these are serious problems. And the corporate response to this has typically been a response that focuses on sustainability, or now more popularly named ESG or CSR, right? Where the essence of that approach is a goal that companies set themselves to reduce their negative impact, reduce their carbon footprint and potentially water footprint and environmental footprint more generally. So the focus is really on reducing that negative impact. And this is an extremely important endeavor that is going to be instrumental if we want to have any chance in avoiding the worst of climate change, right? Decarbonization being like the most known strategy for this. On the other hand, a lesser known but potentially equally important narrative that is emerging in the last 3 to 4 years is the regeneration narrative, where rather than just focusing on doing less bad, the reduction of your footprint, companies and individuals, and countries as well, but mainly companies are starting to consider that they may have an obligation or may see a value in contributing to growing a handprint, which is the opposite of a footprint. So it's the sum of all the good things you do in the world in order to make a positive impact on the world. And this is the regeneration paradigm. And so I'll be speaking about specifically this regeneration paradigm. But now, why do I think this is so important? Well, if you look at the sustainability and the ESG paradigm, the way it's been approached for about 50 years, with the focus on reducing negative externalities, that paradigm is somewhat exclusive. Now, why is it the case? So the focus of this sustainability paradigm is around energy efficiency. Can we use technology to use less energy, make our processes more efficient? It's also around decarbonization, right, which is a very popular narrative now. So can we move from gray to green energy using PV, solar, potentially nuclear fusion, these kind of things. Then there is a strong interest in reduce, reuse, and recycle. And this is the original waste hierarchy. This is how we have to think about how we treat waste. And so that is linked to eco-design, material efficiency, and more recently, ideas around circular business models. Another dimension of sustainability is really this sustainable procurement. So where companies try to acquire inputs and materials and kind of goods that are sustainably produced by suppliers. And then, of course, there is the transportation and logistics, which is now strongly being influenced by electrification. And dominant narrative in transportation is we have to go from combustion engines to electric engines. Optimization, using a variety of programming tools in order to make sure that we optimize the efficiency of our transport. And then right now, what is going on during this very talk, of course, is like the Zoomification of travel or of transport by just avoiding travel altogether and using digital tools instead. And the final step of this entire kind of sustainability paradigm right now is around offsetting, right? So can we buy renewable energy certificates or carbon credits in order to offset whatever kind of negative externalities we cannot reduce yet given current technology. Now, if we look at this, it's undoubtedly true that this is incredibly important in the fight against climate change. But there is a very big caveat to this. And the caveat is that companies can only really engage with this sustainability paradigm if they make things, if they move things, or if they mine things. So if you're in the business of manufacturing, if you're in the business of transportation, and that includes e-commerce where you sell things and you also bring them to people's homes, and if you're in the business of mining, then these processes are extremely important and they should be the main priority for any organization that is active in those kind of industries. But the reality of the current 21st century now in 2022 is that this is a small minority of organizations. And yes, they have a very big environmental impact. But this minority, which is about between 20 to 30% of companies in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in Singapore, where I am, in Hong Kong, bit more maybe in Australia, it's a minority of companies that really can engage with this paradigm. And that's an issue, because if you're working outside of this paradigm, if you're not making things, if you're in the service industry, if you're digital, if you're in pharma, if you're a PR or a marketing agency, if you work for a government agency or a non-governmental agency, if you do any of those things, which is about 75 to 80% of the employed world in the developed world, this paradigm has very little to offer you, because there is not so much you can do in terms of energy efficiency and reduce, recycle if you're not making physical products. So it's really a paradigm that aligns very well with the old economy, but not very well with the new economy. And we need to get the new economy on board if we want to be successful in the fight against climate change. So the reason why this has manifested in this ways, of course, is that the sustainability paradigm and kind of corporate social responsibility came forward out of this old economy. And the way that companies have approached this, maybe somewhat opportunistically, is to look at this and say, can we use this new paradigm that we need to abide by in order to appease investors or appease employees that care about these things? Can we use this and turn it into something that helps us achieve cost leadership? And the focus has to be on efficiency. If we reduce energy consumption, if we reduce waste, if we reduce water consumption, all of those things create efficiencies and hence lead to the reduction of cost. But they've presented it, on the other hand, as a differentiation strategy. And so companies have, for a very long time, tried to say like, hey, we're doing all of these things to reduce our negative impact. And that makes us different from existing competitors. And that has worked for a while, but right now, this isn't working anymore. So what we're seeing now is that more and more investors and consumers and corporate customers start to realize that, hey, sustainability really is a cost leadership strategy. And if we want to use this to create differentiation in the markets, and with differentiation comes superior value appropriation, that strategy isn't working. And so what we are advocating and what our research finds and my own work in my startups find is that regeneration as doing something good for the world on top of your existing business processes is a much more powerful differentiation strategy that leads to superior value appropriation for companies, increases willingness to pay, increases brand loyalty, increases employee loyalty, reduces turnover of employees. All of these positive benefits that are aligned with a company's purpose can be really activated and supercharged by companies entering into this regenerative paradigm. And the benefit of this new paradigm is that it's much more inclusive. Because what this paradigm says is that basically companies should be trying to do something that's genuinely good for the world as part of their business. And any kind of company can do this because the regeneration paradigm isn't tied to your industrial processes that create negative externalities like carbon emissions, like water pollution, like waste creation. It has nothing to do with this. It has to do with how can we create direct impact that genuinely is good for the world, like planting trees, like removing plastic from the ocean, like planting corals, like supporting education, all of those things that are typically considered to be non-strategic philanthropy. How can we create this direct impact, but make it valuable from a growth perspective and from a brand building perspective? And so the way that companies in this space are approaching this is by connecting these direct impacts that they want to create to their KPIs, to their growth metrics, and setting goals for themselves that say, if we reach this KPI, or if we engage in this kind of, if we succeed in reaching this type of growth, then we are going to commit publicly to doing something good for the world. And then, so that links to a pledge that companies are making, and that can be observed typically using digital technology, right? So for instance, you could have an e-commerce store, and I'll give some more examples later, that says, okay, for every sale, we're going to reroute 1% of the revenue that sale generates to some kind of positive impact. Or for every digital event, like one we're having now, we're going to plant a tree for every attendee. Right. So, and these things can be digitally observed and kind of automated so that it becomes embedded in the processes of how a company works without really any additional complications. And then more digital technologies are being used, like monitoring, reporting, and visualization and validation technologies, in order to make sure that these claims that companies are making and the pledge that they are making in terms of what we are trying to achieve in terms of their direct impact is actually materializing over time. So this new paradigm can be done by any company, right? Because you can be a law firm and say, I'm going to connect my billable hours to some kind of positive impact. And then I know if I grow my billable hours, which is my key KPI as a law firm, then I'm also going to do more good for the world. And this can be linked to even like a governmental agency that might link this to, for instance, the reduction in complaints about whatever, noise pollution, right? So loads of these things are possible once you start just thinking about, can we link this KPI that we as an organization really care about and is really instrumental to our success to a direct impact, and then make sure that these direct impacts are hyper credible. And so from an environmental responsibility perspective, the regeneration paradigm invites us to rethink how we attribute environmental responsibility to companies. And so the existing paradigm, the old paradigm, let's say the sustainability paradigm, does this in the following way. And I'm assuming most of you that are here and are interested in sustainability will be familiar with this, right? So the old way is the footprint approach, where the core premise of the footprint approach is that production processes can be made more efficient, and as a consequence, we can reduce our negative impact. This is typically approached by looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are tied to a firm's core operations. Scope 2 emissions are the ones that are tied to the electricity and the utilities that the firm is acquiring in the open market, because the vast majority of firms are not generating their own electricity. And then scope 3 emissions are the entire value chain emissions, all the way up to the supply chain and all the way downstream to the customer, that the firm has some kind of control over. And so, for instance, firms can design more efficient mobile phones that will require less energy when being over time, and so will require less charging. Or they can design more efficient shower heads that reduce the water waste that is happening in those kind of those activities. And so this production paradigm is super important, again, when you're making things, when you're moving things, or when you're mining things, because that's really what you should be focusing on. But again, this approach to thinking about environmental responsibility doesn't really resonate with the new economy. It doesn't resonate very well with the service industry. And while a counter argument might be, well, but the service industry doesn't have that much of an environmental impact. That's true, but it's not very helpful when we are faced with genuine existential crisis caused by climate change and the biodiversity collapse. So we need to think about what is a different way in which we can assign, or at least think about, environmental responsibility. And so the handprint approach, or the regeneration approach, looks at a very different metric, but a metric that's already very well established. And the idea is that consumption patterns are, by and large, the actual driver of any kind of emission, because all types of production leads to eventual consumption. And that consumption done by individuals is eventually what drives the emissions. It is true that China is right now the biggest carbon emitter in the world. But the reason why they are the biggest carbon emitter is because they are creating all the goods that are being consumed all over Europe and the US and Canada and everywhere else in the world. And the question then is like, who is really responsible? Is it the production groups and the production companies and the manufacturing organizations that are making the goods? Or is it the end consumption that is really driving demand for this? And so the handprint approach, the regenerative paradigm, says that it makes sense to think about environmental responsibility from the end consumption perspective. And what it enables us to do is create a very simple measure where we can connect a company's salaries, or an individual's salaries, or the salaries that are involved in a specific campaign or a specific project, and say, okay, this is the total wealth that is being generated at the level of the individual, at the level of the employee, for a specific product. And we can tie this wealth to GDP, and we can tie the emissions of a country linked to that GDP to create a metric that says, okay, per dollar spent in a specific country, the associated footprint, the associated emissions are going to be this much. And we can tell a company that if you want to be regenerative, then what you should be doing is taking responsibility for the consumption patterns that your salaries enable your employees to have. This is a big shift in the way of thinking. But let me give you one very simple example of why I think this is a really powerful shift. Imagine you are like a wealth fund or a hedge fund, and you have basically a small office somewhere in New York, in Manhattan, with 10 people that each have a computer, probably very good computers. And all you do is basically use these computers to move numbers around, and you're making millions and millions and millions of dollars. The environmental footprint of that organization is super small, right? It's going to be a little bit of energy consumption and potentially some kind of compensation for taking public transport or driving your car to and from work, right? It's going to be super, super small. And for an organization like this to say, we are going to achieve net zero or carbon neutrality by 2025, that objective is super easy. And maybe that's not bad, but it's not very helpful, because an organization like this that may eventually end up paying its employees $1 million per year or even more creates consumption power that really drives a lot of negative environmental externalities. And so the idea would be, if you're using the regenerative approach, you as an organization should take responsibility for the consumption power that you give to your customer, that you give to your employees. So it's a big shift in thinking, but the benefit is that if you're a production organization, this approach will give you a lower environmental responsibility. But if you're in the service industry, and again, that's about 70 to 80% of businesses in the developed world, it's going to give you a higher environmental responsibility. And that's what we need to achieve in order to create more action around climate change. And so the way we think about this now is that companies should basically define their environmental responsibility as whichever is higher, either the footprint or either the handprint target, right? So which links the Paris Agreement negative emissions or negative externality goals to the consumption component of the country, and then links that to the salaries that are being paid out. Again, the benefit of the handprint approach is that it's extremely easy to do. All we need is accounting information that every single company has. And that's an advantage, because the downside of the footprinting approach is that it's very, very costly. It requires new data gathering. It requires a lot of investment, a lot of new structures to be put in place. And if a company does that, and it uses this new monitoring capability about all of its negative externalities, its energy, its waste, its water, in order to improve those processes, then that's very good. That makes sense again when you're making things, when you're mining things, when you're moving things. But if a company puts those things in place simply because right now ESG investors, or kind of if they want to be on the the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and they say we need to do this reporting, we need to spend this money on all of these expensive calculations, but we don't really think we can do anything about this anyway, then all of that money, frankly, is wasted. There is no point for them to spend all of this money on expensive monitoring if the goal is not going to be to create significant reductions in the associated emissions. And that money could be much better spent on creating positive impact directly. The net effect on the world is going to be significantly better. So associated with this paradigm shift, just looking at the time, is what we see is that there are shifts in priorities that are occurring in nature, in businesses, and shifts in desired outcomes. So the shift from right now an objective around carbon neutrality and net zero to what was advocated by the World Economic Forum, nature positivity, a shift in thinking from footprint to handprint, and a shift in action from we should focus exclusively really on reduce, reuse, and recycle as the dominant paradigm in sustainability towards an appreciation that companies may choose to say, we're going to focus on supporting natural reserves, on restoring ecosystems, and on rewilding them by eventually taking humans out of the equation and just let nature be nature so that it can do what it does best. And well, besides being beautiful and kind of essential to our human survival, it just absorbs a lot of these negative externalities that our industrial processes are still creating. And so when these priorities are shifting, what we also see is a shift in outcomes where the narrative around corporate social responsibility, which was very powerful and prominent about 10, 15 years ago, has kind of shifted towards ESG right now, but it's just repackaging of the same thing. But now there is a narrative, a very strong narrative around climate justice, which is supported by increasing amount of jurisprudence, maybe not yet in the US, but in Europe and in Australia, for instance, there are court cases that have basically said, okay, a company like Shell, mining companies, you need to take responsibility for these climate impacts that you're responsible for because you're jeopardizing the life of future generations. As I highlighted before, there is a shift. The regeneration paradigm involves this shift from exclusion, focus only on a specific subset of companies from the old economy, to an inclusive paradigm where really all companies can really become agents of change and really do something meaningful in the sustainability space. And at the same time, what we see, but this is very nascent, so it's really early days and we don't see too much, but the next couple of years are going to revolutionize the way companies are engaging in reporting about their environmental and social and governance goals. But right now it tends to be an annual report, sustainability report at the end of the year that is read by very few stakeholders, towards much more real-time data provision, often facilitated by digital technologies like blockchain that kind of make this reporting instantaneous, make it publicly auditable, and create much more transparency and much more verifiability about whether these impacts that are claimed to be created by companies are actually real. So this is kind of the same representation of these things. So what we see, these 6 shifts that I just talked about really changed like the aspiration level from a company from at the company level and at the ecosystem level. So moving towards nature positive, moving towards climate justice, that's just raising the aspiration level. The attention level shifts from these from footprints to handprint, and from ESG reporting to much more real-time feeds, and that aligns with what people are now expecting. We only need to think about the success of TikTok to kind of show that people really care about real-time live feeds. And then the way we act is also really shifting. It becomes more inclusive, and it shifts in terms of the focus on the old 3 R's from reduce, reuse, recycle towards the new 3 R's of reserve, restore, and rewild. And so underpinning all of this, and that's going to be pretty close to the end of my talk with some more example, what is a digital it's a convergence of digital technologies that are really powering this transition from sustainability as a purely efficiency paradigm towards regeneration that is more about creating new value. And so these digital economies that are enabled make information much more affordable, much cheaper, enabled by cloud, by AI, by IoT. And in the environmental space, create a whole new industry, which is known as the digital MRV, digital monitoring, reporting, and validation, that provides very valuable information to organizations about their operations and about what is happening in nature. At the same time, we also have economies in value exchange. Remember, the internet is an extremely powerful engine to transfer information. But the information transfer isn't actually a transfer. It is a duplication, because if I send an email to you, I still have that email myself. And that is incredibly useful for information because it basically creates more knowledge, but it's extremely poor if we want to transfer value. Because if I send $1 to you and I still have that dollar, I've basically devalued my dollar. Now that problem, of course, has been solved by blockchain. Previously, it was solved by third-party intermediaries, but the promise of blockchain and tokenization is really to make these this value exchange both for things that only exist in the metaverse, like NFTs and all of these buzzwords right now, more easy, but also when it comes to benefit claims. When it comes to a company making a legitimate claim like, hey, we have done something good for the world, we've planted 1,000 trees, we've absorbed 100 tons of carbon, we've removed 1,000 kilos of plastic from the ocean, something like this. Blockchain can help tokenize these claims, make them very creditable, make them publicly auditable, and make them exchangeable in a way that previously wasn't possible. And what these two things kind of enable is a much stronger ability of companies and individuals to engage in collective action. Again, facilitated by the internet and other digital technology, massive reduction in the cost of coordination and massive shifts in very successful business models that are really driving, that are really driven by collective action, like platforms, and then in the blockchain space, decentralized autonomous organizations. But the platforms are more well known. So if you think about an organization like Airbnb, which is about as much as the 4 biggest hotel chains, what they realized is that you don't need to own the building in order to make money of renting out the building, right? And so they're completely changing the dynamic from an economies of scale model where building big scale allows you to have a competitive advantage to an economies of collective action and networks model where you say having access to a network of actors that provides resources that are kind of scarcely used creates a much stronger and a much more powerful engine for growth in the digital economy. So I want to leave you with a couple of minutes of just sharing a couple of examples, like how are we seeing these regenerative ideas like playing out in the industry right now? Is this really real or is this still a pipe dream? So I'm going to give a couple of examples. There are many more, but just to give you some ideas, right? So in banking, we see the emergence of regenerative credit cards. Aspiration in the US famously raised $315 million with a credit card that plants trees with every dollar spent. Something similar is being done by Tree Card, also a success, and other companies, including IDEMIA, are working on a general purpose banking technology that could be sold to any kind of neobank, any kind of existing bank to enable these regenerative banking solutions. In the assessment of climate risk, a lot of innovation has been happening. And at climate risk, that's not only relevant if you're trying to plant forests and monitor how much carbon there is being sequestered, although that's a big thing, but also if you want to, for instance, identify methane leaks or other kind of gas leaks in oil pipelines, right? So using space-based monitoring, LiDAR, these kind of technologies can help identify where these leaks are occurring and then much more quickly guide teams to plug those holes in the pipeline, which massively saves costs, but also massively reduces the negative externalities caused by these production processes that we will, from an environmental perspective, unfortunately, still need for a good couple of decades before we can transition out of the oil and gas industry. Other companies like the Indian company Intencell really kind of evaluates the climate risk associated with properties using complex machine learning as well as remote sensing and then sells their services to big property groups, hotels, to kind of help them ensure their climate risk in the future. This is a massive industry that's booming. Within e-commerce, this is probably the easiest way into this, where you see loads and loads of smaller and bigger startups coming into this space, helping e-commerce stores to go green, between brackets, by linking their transactions either to an estimate of the carbon footprint, or by inviting consumers to say, hey, if you want to buy this t-shirt, you can also spend $1 extra and we'll do something great for the world, or by integrating it just in the price and saying, as a brand, we stand for, let's say, a surfing brand, like we really care about the ocean. So 1% or 2% of the money we sell for every product, make with every product we sell, we're going to be rerouting to this coral reef reconstruction or this ocean plastic cleanup project. Right? And so we see this done by small organizations. We see that Porsche has kind of launched this together with South Pole in order to enable its clients to offset the carbon emissions associated with driving a Porsche. But we see the same thing happening in really different industries as well. So for instance, my own company is working with Teats, a digital advertising platform that is the third biggest digital advertising platform in the world, after the two big ones, Google and Facebook. And what we've built with them is an impression counter that is linked to a pledge the company makes. So what you see here is an example of a company that puts advertising on publisher content. So these are the websites of the big newspapers that are typically, the advertising on those is typically managed by Teats. And the company can then say, okay, for every 1,000 people that see this ad, I'm going to plant a tree, and for every 50 people that engage with this ad by clicking on that green banner that says this ad is planet positive, I'm going to plant another tree. And suddenly advertising, which is a $450 billion digital advertising, $450 billion industry, can actually create a positive impact on the world, which is something that just wasn't possible before, right now enabled by digital technologies. And of course, we see this in retail products as well, right? So there are brands like Cariúma, the Brazilian sneaker brand that is planting 2 trees for every pair sold. Tom's very famously has this model of like buy one, gift one, that has recently evolved to buy one, gift something that you care about. And it doesn't have to be a pair of sneakers anymore, but it could be clean water, it could be a tree too, as well. And then we see this now happening with a couple of alcohol brands that are using digital technologies or digital experiences enabled by QR codes, which at least in Asia, we're all very familiar with now because of COVID. We still have to scan everywhere we go to be able to walk into something to prove that we don't have COVID. So, but these QR codes are powerful tools to create a digital experience that you can, let's say, buy a bottle of champagne, you can scan the QR code and it takes you to a story, a digital story around like, okay, this bottle, where has it been? Where does it come from? What are we doing on top of just creating this amazing champagne? We're also planting these trees. You can look at the images of the where the trees are, you can connect with the community, you can create a whole kind of post-product experience that previously wasn't really possible. And so my talk is about this topic of regeneration and how it links to digitization. And my interest, of course, is in finding out, like, I don't know yet who you are and which kind of companies you work for, but do you think your organization is ready to join this regeneration revolution? Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Simon, for a very informative presentation. And just to remind everyone, you can ask questions at any time now. Just type them in that Q&A portion or the chat, and we will get to them as they come in. And right now, our first question reads, up to now, I only heard about eco-design as potential activity beside the classical consumption patterns. What about the role of eco-design in creating regenerative strategies?
Thanks for that question. Maybe Rich, maybe we can remove the presentation slides. So, I mean, I think eco-design is a part of the old paradigm, right? So it is extremely important, like how do we design our products so that they have a lower environmental impact? how do we design for disassembly so that it's easier to dismantle the products after their useful life and then bring them back into the kind of production ecosystem, right? So how do we create more circular models? And this is all extremely useful, again, but it really is anchored in this idea that companies are producing physical goods and then selling those. And it's 20% of the economy. It's 20% of companies. Like eco design, yes, you can have it in digital as well, where you say, okay, we can design our website in such a way that it's going to be optimized for energy consumption. So we're going to use specific font size, we're going to avoid specific colors, we're going to favor black over white, all of those kind of things that reduce the energy consumption. But very few companies will really take a very far-reaching approach in order to say, we're going to make this as energy efficient as possible, because it is about branding, right? So I think eco-design has very strong limits in terms of to whom it can appeal, in terms of which companies can really work on this. It's very important for all the companies in manufacturing that they focus on this, but the regeneration paradigm can really sit on top of this. And what we see in our own work with my startup is that it's mainly the companies that are very advanced in eco-design, and for instance, that are already making products out of recycled goods and have found ways to take them back and have reduced the emissions or the water pollution associated with their products. It's these kind of companies that are kind of leading the field, that are now saying like, okay, we are doing everything we can to reduce the negative externalities. It's not enough. We're going to go further, and we're going to actively contribute to the generation of positive impact, to the generation of public goods by cleaning up the ocean. And so, for instance, we're working with a big brand. I can't tell you their name, but so they're in the kind of FMCG. They're making detergents among other products, and they're saying like, okay, we're going to look at the plastic content of these bottles and kind of see if we can remove the equivalent amount of that plastic from the ocean in order to create a more regenerative business approach, or more regenerative value proposition on top of the eco design.
Hey, great, thanks for the answer. The next question reads, how encouraging more work remote options will help environmental responsibility and an in-person job? Could 4-day work weeks help to increase environmental responsibility? Someone must be tired typing that question because it's worded a little weirdly.
Yeah. I mean, I've never really given that much thought. I think that the evidence on the work from home paradigm, which has emerged, of course, since COVID, and I'm right now working from home, so is actually quite mixed. Most of the evidence suggests that this actually increases the negative impact because of energy consumption, because of air conditioning, heating, that is now much more kind of scattered around houses, which before that, especially in a family where both parents were working and the kids were at school, all of these houses were kind of in a low energy consumption mode for about 7-8 hours a day. And now that has kind of dissipated, while the energy consumption in those office spaces, which still are by and large empty, I mean, not by and large, but still are significantly empty. I think there's an article in the Economies today that still says that about 20% of the buildings in San Francisco, 16% in London, and so are still empty. That footprint of that building is still there, and it's because still some people are going to that office, but there tends not to be the capability of saying like, well, there's now some people in the office, we're only going to put the lights on in one office and the heating in one office. So there's a lot more waste in that paradigm. Whether the 4-day work week would add on to that or would make that better, I mean, we'll have to look at what happens in Sweden, I would say. I'm not too familiar with this. I know that the Swedes are experimenting with a 4-day work week. What it would definitely do is increase consumption. So that's not necessarily good, because when people don't work, they probably do other stuff, like, I don't know, going out, going for a drink. So there might be more consumption, which is not necessarily advantageous from an environmental perspective. And that's really to be seen. I don't really know, is the honest answer.
Okay, great. As a reminder to everyone still on, you can ask questions just by typing in that Q&A portion, and we'll get to them as they come in. The next question reads, The handprint target you present seems to presume two citizens with the same salary have the same total consumption with the same environmental impact. Is that indeed the right interpretation? Because it seems a little flawed.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So that is indeed the right interpretation, and of course factually that's incorrect, right? So that approach to the target needs to be optimized in the future, because right now it would basically say, okay, if you're having the same salary and you have one person that saves 50% of its money and then eats vegetarian and never travels, and the other one spends all of its money, travels all over the world and eats Chateaubriand every day, yeah, they're obviously gonna have a very different impact on the world. So the approach that I present here is a very simple tool that would very quickly enable any kind of company just using data they already have to make an estimate about, okay, what is my environmental responsibility within the Paris Accord if I think about this kind of very generic consumption pattern. And again, if all companies would do this, then of course it kind of levels out, and it doesn't matter that one employee is much more frugal in terms of the use of environmental resources than the other. But yeah, there could be definitely ways to improve that approach, and it's an open science project that I'm involved in, where we basically work with scientists from various universities to figure out how can we improve this handprint target to make it a bit more accurate, while still maintaining this important simplicity that basically enables anyone in a company with access to salary information to define a regenerative target and then get the organization motivated around achieving that target.
Okay, we're on to our final question that's been typed in. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in now. Otherwise, this will be the last one, and we can wrap up a little early. It reads, wouldn't growing a handprint go against the fiduciary duties of the manager? Are shareholders not better able to do good, thorough philanthropy if they choose to?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think that really depends a bit on your stance in terms of what is the role of the company or of the firm in general within society. I think that in theory, I mean, there is this approach to thinking about like the only social responsibility of an organization is to maximize profits. Everything else is really outside of the purview of the company. And if you follow that belief system, then maybe this regenerative approach shouldn't really be a concern of companies. But if you take a more long-term perspective and you think about the ability that a company has to create more value, and this is also appropriate more value by supporting this regenerative approach, then it really could pivot quickly. So to make that very tangible, if you sell a t-shirt at $20 and you make whatever $10 of profit on that, then okay, you have $10 of profit, you have $10 of cost. But if you sell a t-shirt at $25, because you say, well, right now I know I'm going to reroute $2 of that t-shirt to a regenerative project, $10 are still my cost, then you have 11, but then you have $13 left, and so you actually have more profit. And the reason why you can have more profit is because your consumers or your corporate customers as well, in another example, have a higher willingness to pay for a product that has this positive characteristic associated with it. So it's really not only a question about like who can do this more efficiently, it's also who can appropriate more value from this. So it's about changing the business model and changing the way consumers, or at least meeting those emerging demands from consumers, so that a company can say, yes, we're now giving more money away to different good causes, but actually it increases our bottom line. And I genuinely believe that that is possible.
Okay, great, Simon. Thank you for a very informative and interesting session. We were out of questions, and so I guess we can wrap this up a little early. I guess I'll throw it to you then. If you have any closing thoughts, anything you think that people should think about and take away from this session.
I think the most important thing to think about is, depending on, of course, the types of organizations you work in, Like, to what extent can you as an individual agent, an individual employee, an individual maybe business owner, kind of make meaningful change if you're only looking at the old paradigm of kind of reduce, reuse, recycle, and focusing on efficiency? And if your ability to kind of create meaningful change is high in that paradigm, then that's what you should be focusing on. If you care about, I don't know, future generations, climate change, and all of those things that I care about deeply. If your ability to execute change in that old paradigm is not very high, then this approach around regeneration offers a very meaningful alternative where you can generally create incredibly big value, not only for the world at large, but also for your company, by figuring out what is the type of project that we want to support, either through financial donations, either through or volunteering or some other way. Does that really align with who we want to be as an organization, what we stand for? Because of course, everyone right now is jumping on the carbon train because it's very popular. But there may be very different types of projects in terms of, like, I know, providing clean water, providing education services that are just much closer aligned to your organization's mission. Say, okay, can we find that kind of match in terms of these are the types of projects we should support? And once you do that, then say, okay, what are the KPIs that we as an organization or that I really care about in my team? And can we link those KPIs to some kind of commitment? And then once we start doing this and we start talking about this, well, let's see what the response is in terms of clients, in terms of, like, how this affects loyalty and all of the kind of things you may care about as a business. So that would be my advice. Like, think about, can you be impactful in the old paradigm? If not, all right, everyone can be impactful in the new paradigm. It's all about figuring out what is the type of project that aligns with our purpose and what are the KPIs that we need to connect to that. And it's pretty simple then. And of course, if you have any other questions that you want to reach out to me, you have my email address, or feel free to connect on LinkedIn. I'd love to talk to you in a different setting as well.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Simon. I just want to let everyone know that's on that or listening to this via the recording that we're going to put on the Cutter website. We do have a boot camp coming up on March 2nd and 3rd. That's a business strategy approach to sustainable development, which has some relation to this. And don't forget our Cutter Summit, which is coming up in May. And we do also post other webinars on the Cutter.com website. So Simon's information is up. If you have any questions and you think about them after the session, you can send them to me directly and I can forward them on to Simon as well. And my email is whelan, whelan.rich@cutter.com. So once again, thank you everyone for attending. Simon, thank you for a very informative session, and hope everyone has a great day, morning, evening, afternoon, whichever the case may be.
Thank you so much for organizing, guys. It was a pleasure. Have a good whatever part of your day.